Hello and welcome back again, ladies and gentlemen. Last time we looked at the fighting in World War I on land. Today we're going to move offshore to examine what's taking place in the war at sea. Let's take a look at the essential questions. We'll start this session the same way we started the last one, and that's with a little strategy. What's the naval strategy that's being employed by the British, and then how does their strategy lead the Germans to introduce a new weapon into the conflict, the U-boat, or the submarine as we know it, and what's the strategy they're using, unrestricted submarine warfare. What is that and how does it work? Then we're going to move on to the tragedy that is the passenger cruise liner called the Lusitania. What happened to this cruise liner and what impact is that going to have on the war in Europe? Then we're going to jump across the Atlantic to the United States. How are Americans generally viewing the fighting that's going on in Europe? And then what's the chain of events that's going to take place that's going to draw the United States into this overseas conflict? So those are the essential questions. That's where we're headed for today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So at the onset of the war, the British used their powerful navy to control the seas. Now, prior to World War I, Germany and Britain really engaged in a naval arms race, but, Britain is still the top dog despite Germany's best efforts, and the British used that powerful navy to blockade all of the German and Central Power ports that they can get their hands on. The goal here, of course, is to cut off the flow of supplies to the enemy. And it works very well if you're the British, not so much if you're the Germans. They severely cut Germany's military, civilian, and economic supply lines. And it's not just the soldiers on the front lines who are suffering from this, but it's the civilians as well. Thousands of German civilians die of starvation and disease as a result of the British naval blockade. This leaves the Germans to counter with their own new weapon, the submarine, the U-boat, or the Germans call the Unterseeboot. It's a boat that operates underwater. It's a submarine. And so at first the Germans only sink warships because they're trying to break the British blockade. But then in 1915, they begin to shift strategy and start to strike without warning at any ships that they believe might be carrying war supplies for the Allies. Basically, it's like a counter blockade where instead of blocking off England's ports, what they're doing is hitting supply ships without warning so those supplies cannot get to the Allies. This is what you call unrestricted submarine warfare, because it's warfare conducted with these submarines that's not adhering to any particular rules of naval warfare. And I just said rules of naval warfare. The traditional rules of naval warfare involved one ship giving a warning to the other ship before they attack. And then whichever ship sinks the other ship, the victorious ship, is supposed to go and pick up all the survivors. Well, the submarines can't do this. They don't operate under any kind of naval warfare rules. One, because if the submarine hails its enemy and says, hey, I'm getting ready to attack you, kind of alleviates the whole advantage that they have of being an underwater vessel. And secondly, the submarines are very small, so they can't exactly go pick up the survivors either. Unrestricted submarine warfare is a real, terror tactic that the Germans are using to such great success, because you never knew where one of these subs was until it was too late, until you saw the bubble stream of the torpedo about to slam into the hull of your vessel. You typically had no idea the subs were there, and they attacked without warning, and you never knew until it was too late. That's unrestricted submarine warfare, and it works beautifully for the Germans as they manage to really hurt the Allied supply lines and begin to break the British naval blockade of their ports. And it continues to work well until May of 1915 anyway, because in May of 1915, a German U-boat torpedoes and sinks a British passenger ship, the Lusitania. When the Lusitania is sunk, 1,200 civilians are killed, including 128 Americans. Now, I know we're thinking, oh my gosh, the evil Germans, why on earth would they target a civilian vessel like that? They must be horrible, horrible people. Well, you certainly can't make excuses for the death of 1,200 innocent civilians, but with the success of unrestricted submarine warfare, the British began to look to other ways to ship their war supplies, and one of the things they started doing was shipping them on civilian vessels like this. Why did they do this? Because they believed that the Germans were much less likely to attack one of these ships since it was a civilian vessel. Well, the Germans got some intelligence indicating that this is what the British were doing, and so they began to target these kind of ships, in this case, the Lusitania. Again, we must be thinking evil, evil Germans, and this is certainly not a good thing that they were willing to sacrifice all these civilians, but, you know, it also needs to be known that the Germans did warn everyone that they were going to do this stuff. On the left-hand side of the screen there's a big advertisement that says "Notice" at the top. This is an ad, a warning that the German government placed in pretty much every major American newspaper, and they placed this warning right next to the ad that was selling tickets on the trip for the Lusitania. And basically what the warning says is, look guys, if you are going to embark on the Atlantic voyage between the U.S. and the British Isles, you need to do so at your own risk, because you're traveling into a war zone. Our submarines are sinking ships in that part of the world, and you would be better off if you did not travel. You're going into a war zone. Only travel at your own risk. If you're taking advice from us, you probably shouldn't do it. So the Germans are telling people, look, you're going into an active war zone and we're sinking ships. We advise you not to do this. So they tried to warn people ahead of time. And I mean, I suppose you buy that ticket, you know you're going into an active war zone. Of course, you don't think they're going to target a civilian vessel, but, you know, World War I is a different kind of war than any that's ever been fought before it. So 1,200 civilians are killed, including 128 Americans. And so really for the first time, the war over there in Europe is hitting the United States here at home. And so we have to have some kind of response to this. And some Americans are, very riled up and say, okay, we need a military response. Let's go to war. Others are saying, whoa, let's take a more moderate approach to this. Let's think diplomacy. Well, the President of the United States at the time, a guy by the name of Woodrow Wilson, aims to go the diplomatic angle here. Rather than threatening war, he instead threatens to sever diplomatic relations with Germany if they don't stop attacking civilian vessels. Now, that might seem like a threat that doesn't have a whole lot of teeth, but it's a bigger deal than you realize, because if we break off diplomatic relations with Germany, what that means is that we're not friendly with them anymore. And if the United States is not friendly with Germany, then that means the United States is friendly with Germany's enemies. And if we're friendly with Germany's enemies, that means we potentially start helping them, and that's the last thing Germany wants. Germany does not want the United States to get involved, because Germany understands that if the U.S. begins helping the Allies with America's industrial and economic might, it would tip the balance of power in favor of the Allies, and that would be a real problem for Germany. And so because the Germans do not want the United States to get involved in any way, they agree to end unrestricted submarine warfare for the time being. So for the time being, Woodrow Wilson has succeeded in keeping the United States out of this European conflict. And most Americans agree with President Wilson and believe that this is not something America needs to get involved with. Americans are keeping an eye on this stuff. I mean, they're reading the newspapers, they're watching the newsreels, they know what's going on over there in Europe, and they know how horrible it is, and it's just not something Americans want to get involved in. The start of the war has nothing to do with America. As the war has been fought, it's had absolutely nothing to do with the United States, and the vast majority of Americans favor keeping the U.S. neutral. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have one side or another that we're rooting for. I mean, America is a nation of immigrants. And, for example, if you're a German immigrant, you're clearly pulling for Germany. If you're from, Britain, or you're from France, then you're probably pulling for the Allied powers in this. Now, I will say that the British in particular do a very good job of trying to influence American public opinion through propaganda. They put a lot of propaganda out in the American media to try to vilify the Germans. Stories about Germans eating babies and killing innocent people. Yeah, I did say eating babies. There really were stories like that. Then there's the story of the Germans throwing babies in the air and trying to stab them with bayonets. Really horrible things that in no way were actually happening. But the British were trying to use propaganda to turn American opinion against the Germans, because as much as Germany does not want the United States in the war, the British, they really do want us in the war, because they want the United States and our industrial and economic and maybe even military might to be added to their side. But for now, the United States is neutral, and as much as some Americans might be rooting for one side or the other, they don't want anything to do with the fighting. And so for 2 years, Germany does not engage in unrestricted submarine warfare. They do not attack civilian vessels, they only target military vessels. But this hurts the German war effort, because that means the British blockade is still active, and it means that the Allies are getting supplies shipped to them. And the Germans realize that they can't win the war this way. So in 1917, they announced that they're going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. They threatened to sink any merchant ship on its way to any Allied port. They're openly warning everyone, look, we're going to do this again, so sail at your own risk. We will hit any ship, any merchant ship with supplies that is headed to an Allied port. And, just like the U.S. promised we would do, when the Germans say they're going to do this again, we go ahead and break off diplomatic relations with Germany. This is big because it means that we're no longer friendly with Germany. And not only are we no longer friendly with Germany, we become more friendly with Germany's enemies, the Allies, the British, the French, the Russians even. And not only are we more friendly with them, but we begin to actively help them at this point, sending supplies, weapons, and ammunition. Well, what does that make us now? It makes American vessels targets because we're actively helping Germany's enemies, so they begin to target us. And by March of 1917, the Germans have now sunk 4 U.S. merchant ships that were bringing supplies to the Allied war effort. And so the Germans felt like they had to target these ships. And so having sunk 4 American merchant ships, the Germans are now afraid that the U.S. is going to enter the war. American public opinion, which was at one time favoring neutrality, is beginning to shift towards involvement in the war. And Germany hopes to keep the U.S. out of Europe by keeping us busy in North America. They hope that if we're busy doing something over here on our continent, we won't come to their continent. And so to achieve this, the German foreign minister, a guy by the name of Arthur Zimmermann, sends a telegram to Mexico. The telegram, infamous as it will eventually be, was known as the Zimmermann telegram because of the name of the foreign minister there. And in this note sent from Germany to Mexico, the German government promised Mexico that if they would enter the war on the side of Germany and fight against the United States, then when the war was over, the Germans would make sure that Mexico received American territory. Specifically mentioned in the telegram is New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. Why those areas? Well, years and years earlier when the U.S. and Mexico fought the Mexican-American War and the U.S. won, that's land that the U.S. took from Mexico. So the Germans are trying to dangle that carrot in front of the Mexican government to incite them to want to fight the United States. Because again, the Germans reason that if we're busy fighting the Mexicans on our southern border, then we won't be able to make it to Europe to become involved in the war over there. So this telegram is sent from Germany to Mexico. But unfortunately for the Germans, the British intercept the telegram. The British intercept the Zimmermann telegram, they decode the message, and they're more than happy to send it on to the United States. Why? Because remember, as much as the Germans want to keep us out, the British want to pull us into the war. The telegram is sent to the U.S., where conveniently it makes it into all of our newspapers and is quickly published all across the country. And if the U.S. was, if our citizens were at one hand ready to stay neutral and then slowly moving towards war, this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. Americans are now outraged. Like we said before, they were willing to stay neutral, but now there are open calls for war with Germany. The U.S. Congress takes up the issue. President Wilson asks for a declaration of war, and Congress does oblige him. On April 2nd, 1917, Congress votes to officially declare war against Germany, and the United States joins the war on the side of the Allies. American entry in Europe is going to turn the tide of the war. It's the one thing the Germans didn't want, and it's the one thing the Allies desperately needed. American involvement is going to provide military and economic strength to the Allies at a time when they're almost totally exhausted. But that's a good spot to stop for today. So we saw the war at sea. We started with the British naval blockade of the German ports, and we saw the Germans counter with unrestricted submarine warfare. Unfortunately, a victim of that unrestricted submarine warfare was the British passenger ship, the Lusitania. 1,200 civilians die, including 128 Americans. This gets a response from the United States, ultimately over time leading the U.S. to break diplomatic relations with Germany. The Germans think we might get involved. They contact the Mexicans. You get the Zimmermann telegram, and the next thing you know, the United States declares war against Germany, and now a fight that had nothing to do with the United States from its beginning has now drawn America into this war on the other side of the Atlantic. So guys, those are the essential questions. That's what we covered today. Make sure you study those and be ready to talk about those the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.